All right. Okay, folks, thank you for joining. Welcome to the, oh my goodness, we're already into, mostly into May 20th, Joint Masonic Education Series. Very happy to have many states, multiple states participating here, all up and down the East Coast, up and down into the plains, some into California and the West Coast. This is pretty cool, pretty exciting stuff. This Masonic virtual education has taken flight in ways that we never expected and way beyond our wildest dreams. We're working right now to see where we're going to go with it in the future, because Missouri's opening up and I'm here. Several other states are opening up next month after. We're starting to kind of wind down the heavy rotation on the weekly series. And so we're starting to see where we're going to go on a monthly series or bi-weekly or bi-monthly. We're still kind of working that stuff out. So bear with us as we go. Some of these schedules will be a little bit last minute, but keep watching. Definitely stay connected up to Refracted Light. That's going to be probably the best and fastest way to stay updated as to any changes. We'll definitely post changes there. I really appreciate everybody joining. Thanks again. Let's begin in the same way that we always do, and that is that no Masonic function should ever start without the invocation of deity. So please assume a respectful or usable posture. Most holy and glorious Lord God, the great architect of the universe, the giver of all good gifts and graces, in thy name we have assembled, and in thy name we desire to proceed in all our doings. Grant that the sublime principles of Freemasonry may so subdue every discordant passion within us, so harmonize and enrich our hearts with thine own love and goodness, that this meeting at this time may humbly reflect that order and beauty which reign forever before thy throne. Amen.
Will it be?
Thank you. With that in mind, we're going to, so far as announcements go, I think I did them all. Brother Jake Thompson has more Scottish Rite education, if you're a member of the Scottish Rite, tomorrow. And then Friday afternoon, I'm doing a Masonic happy hour. Message me directly if you're not already on that list, and I will get you added to the Friday afternoon happy hour list. Brother Angel Millar is, well, legendary. There are a few people in Freemasonry that don't need an introduction, but I'm going to flail around and attempt to do one anyway. And the 3 stages of initiatic spirituality, craftsman, warrior, magician, is the book on which Angel is talking tonight. And I have to tell you that working with Academy of Reflection, working with the various contemplative groups that I do, this book is on my list, absolutely. I'm heartbroken to have not been able to pick it up and finish it beforehand, and I hope that Angel will forgive me that as I'm doing this introduction. Brother Angel, please take it away.
Thanks very much, and thanks to everyone who's joined tonight and who was interested in listening. So I've talked about my book, The 3 Stages of Initiatic Spirituality, a few times recently, so I'm going to try and mix it up a little bit and talk about it in a different way, or from a different angle, I'd say. But you know, these Zoom education sections, everyone's feeling a little more relaxed. So if anybody finds that they're not following along, or if you have a quick question to clarify something, just let me know. But otherwise, maybe let's keep the more substantial questions for the end. So let's just talk about why I wrote about the craftsman, warrior, and magician. And as with writing any book, it's a long process, but to narrow it down to its essence, I had known for many years that there was a theory put forth by the philologist Georges Dumézil during the 20th century, and he claimed that the ancient Indo-European societies were constructed along the lines of the three castes of the craftsman, warrior, and the priest, or in India that would be the Brahmin. So this sort of magician or elder type of vocation. So craftsman, warrior, and then spiritual elder, spiritual guide, Brahmin, so on. And a few years ago, I came across the book Masonic Temples by William D. Moore. And in there, he makes an interesting claim. And just so you know, William D. Moore was the director of the Chancellor Robert R. Livingston Library of the Grand Lodge of New York about slightly over 20 years ago. Although he's not a Freemason, and he actually was not a Freemason at the time, but he also wrote a book, Masonic Temples. In there, he makes this curious claim that the Blue Lodge, the York Rite, and the Scottish Rite represent the archetypes of the craftsman, the holy warrior, and the mystic. And he also says that the shrine represents the archetype of the jester, but I think that's more debatable because there was originally some intention to make this more of like a serious kind of Sufi type Freemasonry, but it sort of became more fun-loving later on. But for me, it was interesting that he would make this claim that the Blue Lodge, York Rite, and Scottish Rite represented these three archetypes that, according to Dumézil, go back about 5,000 years. And it's, when you start looking for these three archetypes, you do find them pretty consistently throughout history, at least in more advanced cultures and civilizations. Although I would say that in reality, it would be difficult to have any kind of even a tribal society without those three functions being fulfilled. You need someone to grow food and make tools, someone to protect the tribe or to hunt, and someone to act as a kind of spiritual guide who has more knowledge and experience and wisdom. But between the Indo-European societies and modern Freemasonry, according to William D. Moore, you find, for example, Sufism, which in the 12th century was influenced by the craft guilds of the day for its structure. So they also had a structure of kind of three levels with apprentice and master and so on. And Sufism was also influenced by Islamic chivalry, or what's called fatwa. And of course by Islamic spirituality. So again, you have the craft, you have the warrior element of Islamic chivalry, and you have spirituality. And again, with figures such as Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, Plato says that the education of young men should be conducted through through music, which would be the craftsman, wrestling, which is the warrior, and through philosophy, which would be the magician or the spiritual guide or elder. And so you find these in lots of cultures and in different figures. The samurai Miyamoto Musashi as well, not only famous for being a samurai warrior, but also for his calligraphy and painting and landscape gardening. Also someone who meditated, and the samurai is influenced by Zen Buddhism as well. So you find these three, what we might call archetypal vocations, coming together throughout history. And again, Freemasonry in different ways embodying these different archetypes. But I wanted to just look at this from a different perspective, and that is, I mentioned in my book this notion of a progress through time and also a decline through the ages. So in Hinduism, you have this notion of the yugas, or the aeons, which begins with the Sattva Yuga, when everything is in harmony and in harmony with deity. And it goes through various yugas, and we end up in the Kali Yuga, or the Dark Ages, the spiritual Dark Age, when materialism is elevated above everything, and the family is broken apart. Corrupt people are put into high positions, and so on and so forth. And we find this reflected in other cultures. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod described the gods as making a golden race, and again, they were in harmony with nature and with each other, and lived long, healthy lives. And then this golden race disappeared, and there was a silver race and then a bronze race. Each one becoming worse and worse, and until finally you get an iron race, and they're warlike and bloodthirsty and uncooperative. And so you go from the Golden Age to the Iron Age. And in Norse mythology, again, you have this notion of the end of time being this cataclysmic war in which everything will be destroyed. The gods and their enemies will fight and destroy each other. So that would be the Iron Age. And again, although it's not explicit in Norse mythology, if you look at what is said about the beginning of time, or the beginning of the world, it says that the first thing that the gods did was to create temples and forges, and that they had lots of gold. And so again, it seems to be associating this time with the Golden Age, and gold in some respects with not only with the making of tools, but with some kind of religious impulse as well. But the person I wanted to really mention is Ibn Khaldun. And Ibn Khaldun is often regarded as the father of sociology. And he was, I think he was around the 13th century, if memory serves me correctly. But he observed the rise and fall of various dynasties in North Africa. And he claimed that the dynasties went through three specific stages. And in the first stage, a band of warriors would swoop down on a existing dynasty and would take it over, and it would become their dynasty. And they would live by the desert values of harshness and ruggedness, and would not want to sleep in luxurious beds, but would sleep on the floor, and would eschew luxury, and would continue the sort of warrior lifestyle, even though they were now living in a dynasty with a walled off empire, as it might be. And then he claims that in the second stage, the people have become used to the city life and used to luxury, but they still retain this admiration for the desert values, and secretly wanted to return to the desert values. And then he says in the third stage, or the final stage, people have no interest in the desert values anymore, or in ruggedness or the warrior way. And they purely are interested in luxury, and they become weak, and they crave safety and protection, and they ask the leaders to protect them. And the leader is in a precarious position, because he knows that within his society he doesn't have enough people that are capable of protecting society. So he calls on a band of warriors from outside to do the job, and then eventually they will swoop down and take over the dynasty and reinitiate a new cycle, which will end up in the same decline, and then new warriors will come and take over that dynasty. And so I wanted to do something a little sort of mischievous, and that is look at the craftsman, the warrior, and the magician as if they were stages of let's say, of decline, or stages of progress, but stages or ages through our history. And I claim in the book that from ancient Indo-European culture and ancient tribal societies, that you have these three archetypal vocations that work together, and again, manifesting throughout history, whether in Sufism or through Plato's ideas, or most recently in Freemasonry in various ways. And so we might say there's a kind of energy in cultures, but cultures go out of balance because they have this energy, and they're always moving or progressing or declining. And if we look through our history, very roughly, we might say the time of the Crusades and the wars between Christendom and Islam were a time of the warrior, a time of violence and of authoritarianism, and then the Renaissance, a time in which the craftsman archetype is coming to the fore and dominating, a time of invention and artistry and aesthetics and creativity. And then I would say that in the modern age, we're moving ever more into a stage of in which the warrior, in which the magician is dominating our society. And this is just a way we can think about it. But you might object to that and say, well, in the 20th century, we had 2 world wars, so wouldn't that be the age of the warrior? And it's certainly true that we had 2 world wars and other wars as well. But even wars in our time are different to wars prior to that. You won a war 500 years ago by beating the enemy, but increasingly in our time, you win a war by winning the war of the televisual and of the propaganda. So the very notion of terrorism is not that you will win by superior force, but that you will win by superior visuals on the TV, that you will frighten people enough. So it's a kind of, in a sense, it's a kind of psychological warfare that's really being waged, or we could say a magical warfare that's being waged. And and in our time, it's the time in which the psychology or psyche, words and ideas give meanings to things. And there is, for example, a guy called Rory Sutherland. He's an author on advertising, and he's high up in Ogilvy in the United Kingdom, which is an advertising agency that was started in New York. But and he makes the point that advertising actually creates meaning, and I think he's actually correct. But it is a strange thing to think that advertising creates meaning. And how is that even possible? And it creates meaning by reframing the object or the service or whatever is being sold as in a particular way that's appealing to the person. So and obviously we know the ways that it's done by creating scarcity or creating some kind of value, associating value with something. But again, it's this idea that you can create meaning out of nothing. And in our own time as well, we can create money out of nothing. It's not associated with the gold standard or how much gold we have. We can print money, and everything is very much, in a sense, psychological, and what we perceive it to be is how it is. And the media, of course, is not entirely truthful either, but is creating narratives and stories to get us to buy into it. But so I would argue that we're in this very sort of strange psychological era. And again, if you look at social media, which we're all on, we're all presenting ourselves, or most people are presenting themselves in ways that is very unrealistic and much more attractive than they may be in real life, or wealthier than they are in real life, and so on. And so we're sort of removing ourselves from the body and becoming this sort of this psychological simulacra of reality. And this time has been described as a liquid modernity by a Polish philosopher called Zygmunt Bauman. And his idea is that everything is sort of fluid, which is kind of what I'm saying as well. But so you could talk about liquid assets, or since his death, we also have the idea of a gender fluid. So everything is very fluid and nothing is stable. And when nothing is stable, it is essentially the realm of the psyche, that everything is constantly moving and has nothing fixed about it. And so I want to ask, how the three archetypes can be useful to us in our time, and especially in relation to Freemasonry. So just to look a little bit at the history of these three archetypes, if we go back to Plato, for example, Plato describes the creator as a craftsman, and the Syrian Platonist Iamblichus describes the monad as the craftsman, and the monad would be essentially the first cause. So we could liken that in Kabbalah to something like an Ein Sof, this sort of nothingness out of which everything emerges. And Plato also describes this craftsman deity creating the world through geometrical shapes or geometrical solids. And both of these things would similar or have a relationship to Freemasonry today. So we talk about the great architect. And we, of course, use builders' tools and architectural tools as symbols or metaphors for, we might say, elements of our own psyche, but of natural laws that are embodied in the world as well. And so we can see a kind of parallel between Plato's thinking and Freemasonry, but the craftsman has had a role in initiation and spirituality for probably thousands of years. So if we go back into sort of tribal societies, the blacksmith often had a kind of semi-shamanic function, the shaman being the kind of priest figure or wizard priest figure, and the blacksmith had some initiatic function of initiating young men, and of course initiating them into the guild or the vocation of blacksmithery, and so you find that figure being embodied in mythology, for example, in the figure of Thor, whose beard glows red hot and sparks come from him when he's angry. His hammer glows red hot and has to be held with a special gauntlet, and so on, which appears to be the blacksmith's hammer. And he also has a piece of whetstone embodied in his forehead, whetstone being used to light fires. And later on, of course, coming into the, let's say, Renaissance period or before that, so the parallel would be alchemy, and alchemy drawing a lot of ancient Greek symbolism, of course. But again, we go from the blacksmith as the initiator to alchemy using this process of refining metals as a metaphor for the refinement of the individual, and sort of becoming enlightened or attaining some kind of spiritual understanding that would align him with deity. And moving on to the warrior. Well, let's ask, so, what is the importance of the craftsman? Well, so the importance would be a couple of things, and one is that the craftsman is associated with initiation, whether it's in Freemasonry today or the blacksmith of a couple of thousand years ago. And an initiation is important because in a world in which everything is sort of fluid and in motion, and nothing is stable, and there's no tradition because everything is breaking apart, as it would seem, the initiation can give us a kind of solid ground to stand on, and can give us something definite to work with. And one of the problems of today is that because everything is so fluid and so open, that anything is possible and everything is permissible to us. But precisely for that reason, everything is a little bit boring. And if you look at the fine art world today, let's say the official fine art world today, there's really no taboos to break because it's all been broken. But it's also a lot less exciting. No one really cares what fine artists are doing anymore. Everybody cared about what Picasso was doing or what Salvador Dali was doing. They were doing something revolutionary. And people cared about the French Impressionists, and they cared about paintings, and going to see a painting in a museum was, 100 years ago was a big deal. Whereas now it's not a big deal because it's just so open. But initiation gives you tools to work with. Those tools in Freemasonry are obviously symbols, but it gives you a tradition to think through and an orientation. And in the case of initiation, it's an orientation towards God and towards our own death and what's through our death and what's beyond it. And in a more practical sense, if we want to look at these outside of symbolism, the crafts also are about using material and creating something that's actually concrete and real and lasting. And moving on to the warrior, the warrior, like the craftsman, has always been associated with some kind of spirituality, and in legend associated with it, but also in very real terms. So we're all probably aware of the Shaolin Temple with Buddhist monks practicing Kung Fu, and the Knights Templar being Christian monks, but also warriors. And there are other examples of this as well. In India, you have the martial art of Kalari Payat, which is a very gymnastic and energetic form of martial arts. It looks a little bit like some forms of Kung Fu, but there's a lot of flying through the air and leaping with swords. But in that martial art, traditionally in a Kalari Payat temple, there would be an altar to the goddess Kali in the corner, and again in Iran or Persia, you have the martial art of Zirkana, and Zirkana is very much influenced by Shiism and Sufism, and there's always a picture of the son-in-law of Muhammad, Ali. And Ali was also the first person to accept Islam and is considered to be a great warrior within Islam. He's sometimes called the Lion of Islam. And there's always a picture of Ali on the wall. And the performance of Zirkana is based loosely on Sufi rituals as well. So there's a drumming by a master, and exercises are repeated. So, for example, they have a very heavy wooden shield, which they lay on their back and lift the shield several times or many times over. And the way it's counted out is not 1, 2, 3, but Allah is 1, Allah is not 2, and each of the numbers has a specific sort of symbolic meaning associated with Islam and more particularly with Shiism. But if we look at the mythology of the warrior, you find I always think this is one of the best examples is in the Bhagavad Gita, where the Godhead Krishna, and he's conceived to be literally what we would call God. The Godhead Krishna is waiting on the battlefield with his disciple Arjuna, and the enemy army has arranged itself before them, and Arjuna says, I don't want to fight in the battle because I see my cousins and uncles in the opposing side. And Arjuna says, well, you must fight them. The worst thing to be in the world is to be a coward. And but he says, when you are striking down the enemy, it will be me striking you down. And it's at that moment that Krishna, who looks sort of human, pretty much. It's at that moment he decides to reveal his cosmic form, and in his cosmic form he has millions of arms, millions of legs, and millions of heads, and the whole of creation is sort of whirling around within his torso, and his eyes are the sun and moon, and it's noticeable that Krishna doesn't reveal this celestial form in a temple or in a forest grove or in a meditation session somewhere that's peaceful, but it's on the battlefield that he reveals his form. And as if there is something important about going into battle in life. And this notion, which sounds kind of barbaric, that when Krishna says, when you're cutting the enemy down, it will be me cutting them down, I'm moving through you. And although it does sound barbaric, the meaning is, in a sense, that at the center of our being is God, and God moves through us, and what we do is, in a sense, sort of is impersonal. And the metaphor or the motif of the battle is that we sometimes have to do what we don't want to do. But getting back to the more worldly or semi-worldly side of the warrior, and of course we have warrior symbolism in Freemasonry, not only in the York Rite, especially in the Order of the Temple or the Knights Templar degree, and in the Scottish Rite with various knightly or chivalric degrees as well. But we have in the Craft Lodge, we also have the symbol of the sword pointing at a naked heart, and of course the tireless sword protecting the lodge. But there are different meditations associated with each of these archetypes, and typically with the warrior is a meditation on one's own mortality, and particularly in the samurai, in the samurai manual called the Hagakura, which is a fairly bloodthirsty manual, but in there it recommends that the samurai meditate upon his own death every day and imagine being killed by spears and swords and by disease and so on, and to get used to the idea of dying and as if one is already dead and just living beyond that. And of course you find motifs of death elsewhere, and you certainly find it in Freemasonry, but although some anti-Masons like to play up the symbolism of mortality within Freemasonry. If you walk into a church, obviously what you see facing you is not baby Jesus; it's Jesus on the cross, and sometimes in traditional Christian art of the crucifixion is sometimes a skull at the bottom of the cross. Because Jesus was crucified on Golgotha, or the hill of the skull. And so meditation on death is something that we don't like to do today, but it's something that all cultures have done. And in Christianity, you find it during the Black Death. There was actually a kind of Christian meditation called Memento Mori, where you would remember your own death. And this is something that we are kind of uncomfortable thinking about today, as if we're going to live forever. But so if we look at what the warrior has to offer us in this world in which everything seems to be very much floating and fleeting, and it's very difficult to get a hold of anything because it's always continually changing. What the warrior archetype has to offer is not only being physically present in the world, so no longer an avatar on social media, but physically present in our body and strengthening our body and getting to feel present in our own body. But is this meditation on mortality, which of course in Freemasonry we find this in some of the degrees, but we also find this in the chamber of reflection as well. And I know that in one, the Scottish Rite chamber of reflection, which people experience before the first degree. There's often sayings written on the walls, and one of the sayings in the Scottish Rite Chamber of Reflection is, if you want to live well, remember your death. And of course, the point of that is not to feel, woe is me, I'm going to die, but to really think about what would be important to me when death approaches, because it's not going to be, how much sex we had or how much money we accumulated. And, we might need money for living, that is true, but it is not our highest calling. And when we think about our mortality in a serious way, we can think about, well, what really does make my life worth living, or what do I really feel called to do? And so in a strange way, thinking about our mortality can focus us in life and make us more dynamic. And it is kind of true that I was reading recently about Aubrey Beardsley, and he died when he was 26, and he caught, I believe it was tuberculosis when he was about 6 years old, and there was no cure at the time. And Aubrey Beardsley was a famous artist in Britain, and he was described as living, to paraphrase, living with the energy of someone who knew that they were going to die. And the same with Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs said he would think about his death every day, and if he didn't like what he was doing for too many days in a row, that he would change it. So this meditation on death can spur us to live the kind of life that is really a calling for us. But moving on to the last of the three archetypes, the archetype of the magician. So if we are in an age in which the magician archetype is dominant, and there is, of course, this notion of being, we'll say, white magic and black magic, not all magic is good. And the same with psychology. You can use psychology to kind of heal someone of their own wrong thinking, but you can also use psychology to manipulate people, of course, and that's partly what advertising is doing, or that's the intention of advertising originally. Although, again, with someone like Rory Sutherland, he would say that advertising is also creating meaning and creating value, which is also true sometimes. But what does it mean to sort of engage the magician archetype in a world in which everything appears to be almost like magic? So we can change whatever we want. We can choose our identity, choose our agenda, choose really everything about us, and change everything about us, and continually change everything, so that there's no stability. And the idea of gender fluid as well is that you can be male one day and female the next, or later in the day. That's constantly changing. And this actually is an aspect of the magician archetype. If you look at shamans, which were the sort of ancient wizard priests, as they might very crudely be called, they were very often men who dressed in female clothing, so they were neither male nor female, or, to put it more accurately, they managed to harmonize the male and female in one body, and in a sense embodied nature and transgressed against nature at the same time, because there is nothing male and female in nature. So, but nature is made up of male and female. And in terms of shamanism, it's really this ability to embody nature and to transgress against it at the same time that gives the shaman his power, which makes him beyond the human being, and between the human being and the god, so that he can converse with the gods or can converse with spirits. And part of his job would be to heal people by casting out the spirit of the sickness from the person. So you find this gender kind of ambiguity in the shaman archetype or the magician archetype, and we see it today. And again, this kind of psychology, the use of psychology in advertising, and even the use of psychology as a weapon of war, particularly in terrorism. and just this strange kind of constant churning and moving, and this idea that ideas are more important than real things often. But engaging the warrior, the magician archetype in this age might be both dangerous and necessary. And if we look at, let's say, if we look at modern magic, let's just touch upon that. Having mentioned shamanism, you know, magic in the medieval period and a little bit later was essentially a scholarly pursuit by educated, and often by, say, bishops or someone like that, or educated people with a lot of money and who could afford manuscripts. And it was, again, largely a solo pursuit. So if we take John Dee, who's probably the most famous magician prior to the modern age, John Dee was not in a sort of magical group or a magical order receiving magical initiations. Rather, he was learning and practicing magic by himself or with the aid of his assistant, Edward Kelly. And, most famously, Edward Kelly and John Dee were attempting to evoke angels and to communicate with them and to understand the language of the angels, and then to find out about, let's say, prophecies and so on, and to have a window into the angelic realm or into the realm of God, and via these subordinates, these angels. But it was a solo pursuit, and then really after Freemasonry emerges, let's say, officially in 1717 with the coming together of 4 lodges in London, and then it's moving across continental Western Europe through France and Germany in particular. Then you get the creation of these quote-unquote higher degrees and these new rites. Some of them are claiming to be Masonic, or to be the original Masonic rite, or to have the original Masonic secrets that have been lost. Or some of them are just inspired by Freemasonry, or take the structure of Freemasonry and use it for other ends. So one of the Masonic rites for Germany that was for a long time during the 18th century, it was the most popular, and that was the strict observance rite, which claimed to derive from the Knights Templar, but claimed to be a Masonic rite. You have other rites or other orders, such as the Illuminati and the Golden Rosicrucians, or the Golden Rosy Cross. But with these higher degrees emerging in Freemasonry in France and Germany in particular, they absorb a lot of Hermeticism and alchemy and Christian mysticism, the Knights Templar, and so on. And so you get degrees even today, such as the Rose Croix degree. And the Rose Croix was a very, very popular degree, and was introduced into most Masonic rites up until today. And at one point, the Knights Templar actually conferred the Rose Croix degree as well. And you can find versions of the Rose Croix in other paramasonic rites, such as Memphis and Mizraim as well. But so Freemasonry absorbs a lot of this, what we would think of as being sort of almost occult material, the alchemy, Hermeticism. And then from there, these other orders begin to adopt the Masonic structure and to absorb a lot of this Hermetic material. So in the 18th century, you have the Golden Rosy Cross, or the Golden Rosicrucians, and they start out with 1 degree. And by the end of the century, although they have collapsed by the very end, before the collapse, they have 9 degrees, and they make the claim that they have the ability to raise spirits with the aid of a ghost raising machine, and they claim to have the elixir of life, which is from alchemy, and they also claim to be able to practice alchemy as well. And this doesn't sound particularly Masonic to us, but to join the Golden Rosicrucians during that century, when it was alive, you had to be a Freemason and you had to have taken the 4th degree, which was the Scots Master degree at that time. So all of the members were Freemasons. And I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from Lessing's Masonic Dialogues. And this is by Gotthold Lessing, who was a playwright in Germany in the late 18th century. And he wrote these, what we might think of as Platonic dialogues between a Freemason and a non-Freemason. And this should give you a little bit of a sense of what was going on during the late or the latter half of the 18th century in Freemasonry. It's a fork. That I perceive in all these dreamings a striving after reality, that it allows one to deduce from all these wrong ways whither the true way leads. Ernst, also from the manufacture of gold, fork, also from the manufacture of gold. Whether it is really possible to manufacture gold or not is all the same to me, but I am quite convinced that that intelligent men will wish to be able to manufacture it only with respect to Freemasonry. Also, the first person to whom the philosopher's stone will be vouchsafed will be at the same instant, become a Freemason. And it is none the less remarkable that all reports which the world tells of real or supposed gold manufacturers confirm this. Ernst, and those who conjure up spirits, folk, the same applies practically to them. Spirits cannot possibly listen to the voice of any other person than a Freemason. So it's not your average lodge night, clearly, what's going on there. And maybe it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but clearly there was a widespread perception, quite rightly, that the Freemasons in Germany of the 18th century, or the latter half of the 18th century, many of them were involving themselves in alchemy and raising spirits and so on and so forth. And it was kind of the wild west of Freemasonry, really. But by the 19th century, then you start getting other orders which resemble the Golden Rosicrucians, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the founders of which were Freemasons. So they take the structure, which was originally the structure of the Golden Rosicrucians. It was absorbed into the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia in about 1866. And the Societas Rosicruciana is still going. It's a society for Freemasons. It's a Rosicrucian society. It was originally founded allegedly as a kind of research body for Freemasonry, but the emphasis really was not on researching Freemasonry per se. It was more on researching the spiritual and esoteric traditions of the world, so Kabbalah, alchemy, Rosicrucianism, those three in particular, but it could be any spiritual or esoteric tradition. But so the Societas Rosicruciana adopted that degree structure from the Golden Rosicrucians, and then the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn adopted it from there. And the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is an occult society, and it's one that had an enormous impact on the world of the occult during the 20th century. And the other order that would be of significance it would be the Ordo Templi Orientis. And again, this was founded in Germany. And it was originally conceived by a couple of Freemasons, Theodor Reuss and Karl Körner. And they conceived that it would be a kind of college of rites for Freemasonry, and it would confer different Masonic rites, such as the Scottish Rite, which was not active at that time. And but later on, they introduced this concept of sexual magic, and it really became essentially a cult order. It was never recognized by Freemasonry as legitimate, and was later on taken over by Aleister Crowley, who was probably the most colorful, but also the most notorious magician of the last couple of centuries. And the Ordo Templi Orientis and the Golden Dawn are both quite structured. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in particular is extremely structured, with lots and lots of different rituals and degrees. But both of these were very influential during most of the 20th century, and then probably about around the 1970s or 80s, the occult world starts to become much more experimental and fragment, and to leave this sort of structures behind. It might be to do partly with the emergence of Wicca, which is, let's say, the religion of modern witchcraft, or the religion of witchcraft. They sometimes claim to be very ancient. But again, that is influenced by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It's also influenced by the writings of Crowley. You find elements of this in its rituals. And it also takes one or two things from Freemasonry. It talks about the working tools. It describes itself as the craft, or the witchcraft, or the craft of the wise. But again, it has working tools, so that they are the sword, wand, and so on. And it has symbols that we would recognize, such as the point within the circle and the pentagram as well. Although symbols can have different histories, so it's not necessarily that they took them from Freemasonry, but there's probably some overlap there. But it might be because of the emergence of Wicca within the occult world as a fairly popular phenomenon. But around the 70s and 80s, the occult world starts to become much more experimental. The Temple of Psychic Youth, which was founded by Genesis P.R.H., who was a musician and an artist of sorts. They're kind of involved in experimental living, and sort of questioning everything about his life and the lives of the members involved in it. And there were other movements such as chaos magic, which again is a much more eclectic and creative movement. It hasn't really died out. I think it's become a kind of shallower version of itself where anybody can do it. Whereas originally it was more about a little bit about science, maybe a little bit about psychology, but a lot about absorbing different techniques from different systems and then seeing what worked. But it was also a little bit on the darker side of things as well, whereas now it's a little bit more bubble gum in its packaging. But there's a crossover between this sort of modern magic and other phenomena such as positive thinking. This idea of using the mind to transform reality, and that's also something that really differentiates itself from particularly the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was much more in a sense sort of mystical and not self-transformation, whereas the chaos magic and the occultism of today can often be much more about changing one's circumstances, so getting a better job through magic or a more ideal romantic partner and so on. But so let's just ask, what does it mean to embody the magician archetype in this kind of world? And I suppose you could say it means fighting fire with fire, but it also means really equipping oneself to be in a world that is more psychological, and understanding that psychology and the mind and thinking is an important factor not only when dealing with other people, but with one's own self, making sure that our thinking is conducive to our way of life, not defeating ourselves with defeatist thoughts or negative thoughts, but making sure that we are mentally equipped to deal with the life that we have, and progressing in the way that we want, but also understanding that we are every day up against a psychological phenomenon, whether it's advertising or dealing with someone in the office who smiles to us when they see us, but is trying to manipulate things against us behind our back and so on, which is pretty common. Or understanding that the media is portraying a picture, it's not really telling us the facts. It's sort of interpreting the facts and claiming that that it's an accurate picture when it's usually not. Or whether it's looking at something like terrorism, which is trying to affect us by not through violence so much, but by manipulating our psyches by through limited action, but one that becomes all-encompassing in our own minds and terrorizes us. And but well, all three of these archetypes can be of value, and to a degree we find them in Freemasonry, as William D. Moore would say. The craftsman in the crafts lodge, the warrior being represented in the Knights Templar degree, and the magician to a certain degree, whether we mean magic in a literal sense or a philosophy or some kind of spiritual or mystical elevation in, say, the Rose Square degree of the Scottish Rite. But I think ideally for me, and I say this at the end of my book, The 3 Stages of Initiatic Spirituality: Craftsman, Warrior, Magician. At the end of the book, I suggest that really the way forward and what's essential for us is that we embody each of these archetypes in different ways, and the craftsman, to really bring it down to the most basic and material level, to, if you're going to embody the craftsman, take up an art or a craft or a skill and develop it. Because a lot of what we do today, especially for work, we never see the beginning, or we never see it through from beginning to end. We usually are doing something quite repetitive, even if it's a slightly more elevated a level of employment, not the most basic level. Even if you're a designer, you're only designing a part of something. So a car, somebody working on designing a car might be just designing one part of it, the lights or the wheels or something. But, so to practice some kind of skill that you can take from beginning to end and develop and get better at, and also to help improve you in a certain sense. With the warrior, to develop your body, to develop your physical strength, and to develop your own awareness of your own body, not just physical strength, but an awareness of your physical presence. And with the magician, to practice some kind of spiritual tradition, at least meditation and praying every day, and maybe other things besides that. But to get in a routine where these things are done, at least most days. And you can do meditation and praying every day, and maybe you work out a couple of times a week, and maybe you practice an art once a week. But I'll just say that in my own practice, what I particularly like to do is say work out for 45 minutes, then meditate. And I meditate on the chakras normally, and then when I've done that, I'll read a classical text, and it might be the Bhagavad Gita, or it could be the Dhammapada or something like that. But there are plenty of other texts you could read. It could be the Bible or the Quran or whatever it might be. So I try to work through the let's say each of these different archetypes in different ways on a pretty regular basis. But let me just finish by saying this, that although we're in a very strange world today where it's extremely psychological and it's very much a mirage that we see most of the time, being Freemasons, we do have an advantage over many other people, because many other people are very much locked into the present and have no sense of history. And if you want to know the future, you need to know history and to know the past, because it does repeat itself. And we also, as initiates, have some kind of orientation, as I say, through life towards our death, and what is through death. And it's, in a sense, a higher orientation. It's our orientation is not what junk food can I eat, or what entertainment can I use to distract me. It's about how can I develop myself for this journey through life and through my mortality, and to come face to face with deity beyond, or with the divine. Well, that's really it. But if anyone has any questions at all, just let me know on anything I've touched upon.
Thank you, Brother Angel. That was amazing. It's truly amazing. There are no questions in the chat from Refracted Light. And we don't have any questions at the moment from the Zoom session. Does anybody have anything that they would like to bring up? Brother Angel, I really appreciate you touching on the importance of daily practice in some way, shape, or form. And I think that that's one of the things that we might not be stressing enough in Freemasonry, in that you have your own contemplative practice, your own focus, your own work that you need to do, along with the work with the lodge and the work with the outer lodge and the greater community around you. Do you have any particular thoughts on that kind of balance between the three?
Yeah, so I mean, the teachings of Freemasonry definitely give us some good things to work with, and you can think straight away of the 24-inch gauge, which it's very difficult for people in this day and age to apply this, dividing their time each day. And although it's unrealistic to divide it into its 3/8, nevertheless we can divide it into a suitable amount of work, a suitable amount of time for thinking about higher things, meditation or whatever it might be, or contemplation, and definitely getting enough rest, which is what a lot of people don't do. I would just mention that I mentioned this yesterday, but the Catholic theologian Joseph Piper talks about how leisure and contemplation are really the basis of foundation. And, that's a part of the 8 hours to God. But, it's something that we definitely don't do enough. We react to things, we don't contemplate things anymore. So contemplating things and thinking about things deeply and trying to understand them, and really being okay with not understanding it at first, or coming to a conclusion that is different to the one you began with, or the opposite of the one you began with, that's really essential. And let me just give a small practice that I really recommend that people try a couple of times. A lot of people will say things like, "Oh, I read that book in 2 hours," or "You can read that book in an hour and a half. It's really short." But it depends what kind of book it is. But if it's a serious book worth reading, you can't read any book in 2 hours or an hour and a half. You have to think about things as you read through it. And in the Christian monastic tradition, there's a practice called Lectio Divina, which it just means a divine reading or spiritual reading. So it's not like the reading we do today, where we skim a blog post, or we get involved in arguing in the comments on Facebook. There is a particular practice of Lectio Divina. I mean, it can just mean reading slowly and contemplating each passage, but in Lectio Divina, you meditate on God. You read one passage, and you think about that meaning. Think about the meaning of the passage and just contemplate it. and then just sit quietly and not even really thinking about anything, but just be quiet in yourself, think about God again, and then see if there's any kind of any nuances or new ideas that come to you about that passage. So you want to read a short passage, and if you meditate on that passage for 10 minutes, your ideas will come to you, and you'll see it in an entirely new light. And there's a big emphasis on the esoteric today, but the esoteric, which means inner, depends on there being an outer, and people mistake the esoteric for the occult. Like, well, I did some weird practice or I made up some ritual, so that's esoteric. It's actually not esoteric at all, because esoteric is the reinterpretation of religious texts in a sort of more elevated or more mystical or more metaphysical way. It's not concerned with the daily rules of behavior, for example. And so if you read a passage from the Bible, you think about God, just become quiet after you've read it, think about the meaning. If you do that for 10 minutes, you have a totally different understanding of that passage. And, I absolutely recommend everybody do that. But in regard to, let's say, the lodge and to society, well, in regard to the lodge, I think we will have to contribute as best we can. I mean, and if for a new Mason that's just joined, maybe the best way to contribute is just to be quiet and to learn as much as possible and to contemplate it. And maybe for someone who's been in a few years, maybe they want to take a chair, or maybe they have something else that they can contribute to the lodge. And personally, I think my best contribution is probably giving talks, but it could be something else for other people as well. I know in some lodges you might have a brother who cooks the meals for them and this kind of thing. So, and we should contribute, not just making work for ourselves, but contribute what we love, and hopefully that by contributing we'll also be developing ourselves as well. So it's a win-win situation. And in regard to society, it's definitely valuable and important to contribute to society in some ways. And, that can be done in different ways. I know some people volunteer at soup kitchens, or we might be helping our brothers in lodge. They're also a part of society, of course. And, or just being there for someone who needs to talk about something and just listening to them. That could be another thing. Or for me, obviously, I try to make sense a little bit of the world and help people make sense of it. So there are different things we can do, but I think it's important not to make work for ourselves, but to engage with the lodge and with society, and to have practices that actually help us to grow. Because the more we want to do it, the better it is for everyone else and for ourselves. So that would be my advice.
Awesome. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Okay, you guys know I talk a lot and I ask lots of questions, but I do want to open it up. Does anybody have anything that they would like? I know.
Hey, Brother Randy.
Yeah.
Hear me?
Yes.
Internet not wonky? I always have to open with that. So Brother Angel, I came in a little later. I was interested in two ideas that kind of struck out to me very fully. The first one I wanted to go to was in regards to the magician. Are you at all familiar with the Ardhanarishwar form of Shiv?
Sorry, can you say that again? I don't think I am from what you said, but if you could just repeat it.
That's okay. Sorry, I come from a really classical Eastern background.
Okay.
But Ardhanarishwar, the half man, half woman form of the god of the Hindu pantheon, Shiva.
Oh, okay. I'm not really familiar with Shiva so much, I have to say.
It's quite all right. So the Ardhanarishwar form is actually really interesting. It occurs within the process directly after the manifestation of deity into sort of a um, physically contemplatable form, and it's often depicted as a half man, half woman.
Mm-hmm.
And the words that are actually used within the text are Purush and Prakriti.
Right. Yeah.
And I was wondering, in terms of that, you were speaking sort of the shamanistic cultures of and how there's that fluidity there. Is there any sort of connection, do you feel, in that sort of same idea of trying to harness both, because Purush is essentially space, and
Right.
Prakriti literally translates to nature,
Right.
and is given the divine or the sacred feminine component. So, is
Mm-hmm.
there any sort of connection that you found in this entire work where the magician is essentially trying to harness both of those things in some way, shape, or form?
Harness the male and the female.
Right.
Yeah.
Because we do sort of live in this gender fluid society.
Yeah.
I mean, and
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Well, very definitely the shaman is trying to harness the male and the female. That's right. And so there are different outfits that the shamans have worn, and one of them resembles like a bird or a bird skeleton, and another one is a skeleton. But certainly it's very, very common that shamans have worn male shamans have worn female dress, and have been seen as sort of neither male nor female, and or as both male and female, or some way sort of transgressing the genders and uniting them. And as I mentioned, it's this idea that you're bringing the whole of creation into one being. So you embody nature, but you're also transgressing against nature, or you're sort of outside of normal nature, which is either male or female, but not both. But yes, and in Hinduism as well, you have the Shiva lingam, right, which is it's a sort of almost like an egg-shaped stone, and it's considered both male and female as well. And
the lingam is actually, it's considered the male. The counterpart to it is considered the yoni.
Right. Yeah.
Right, which is it's actually the motif there is that the yoni is the word for the temple, and the lingam is where the temple resides. So it's but yeah, there's also sort of that just brought on another thought. It was really interesting to think about the idea of Native American shamanism, as you were talking about it, and how there are, I can't remember off the top of my head, is it 4 or is it 5 genders within sort of the Native American traditions?
Right. Yeah. Actually, I don't really know that much about Native American traditions, but I do know that there's a couple of terms for different genders, which are not male or female. But,
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Matt Stewart. Let's see. Isn't it common in Eastern culture to combine male and female characteristics? In Eastern cultures, yin yang, yeah. Okay, so that's what we just talked about. All right. And okay, that was loud. All right. Any other questions? Do we have anything? Brother Angel, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I had a question quickly.
Okay.
Angel, you had referred to time and time moving in kind of a cycle from craftsman to warrior to magician. And you referred to nowadays as being like the magician phase.
Yeah.
I guess this is a 2-part question. Do you think that the cycle always moves in that order, or does it move out of order?
Yeah,
and
that's
also, would you compare the advance in technology nowadays to the craftsman phase?
Yeah. Probably not, but so yeah, I mean, there's no historical theory that the three archetypes have a kind of progression through time, but that's sort of a personal observation. I think you can see it and you can relate it to these ideas of the aeons, whether it's like the Hindu notion of the yugas or Hesiod's idea of these golden races and silver and bronze and iron races and so on, or the Norse idea of this cycle of the creation of the gods and then the total destruction. But yeah, so and I think yeah, so would they always move in that order? That's assuming that societies tend to go out of balance. I don't think it's necessarily the case that they would progress in that order. But I do think that we've gone through a sort of more warlike period of like the Middle Age, or at least the Crusades, let's say, through the Renaissance, which was definitely more about skill and craft and ingenuity and artistry and aesthetics. And now, today, I definitely think we're in this a very definite sort of magical phase. But yeah, and obviously within each phase, you would have the other two present because it's out of balance. They're not missing the other two, but as regard to today's technology, no, I definitely would not regard that as the craftsman. I would regard it as essentially the magician. I mean, it uses physical things, so in that sense, it has a craft element to it. But the essence of the craftsman is really about creating something of beauty, something that's lasting and something that's meaningful, and also traditionally, at least, something that represents the divine, or the very, very, very least, some kind of higher ideal. You look at the cathedrals or any kind of temple around the world, or any kind of artistry. It's either trying to embody beauty, and prior to the modern world, we should say, it's either trying to embody beauty, or it's trying to tell us something about reality, usually with reference to a religious text, or it's trying to impress upon us the nature or grandeur of the divine. So, why is a cathedral enormous? And the answer today is always the sort of cheap answer that it's about power. But walk into a cathedral and you're reminded of this enormous space. But why when you're walking out in the open air, you're not reminded of this enormous space? So the cathedral reminds us that there is this enormous space out there, because we tend to forget it. And then it's logical to think that there's an enormous space in this building. The universe is even bigger, and God is even bigger than that because He created it. So there's something transcendent about the craftsman, and hence there is this initiatic function with the blacksmith, or with alchemy, or with Freemasonry, coming out of stonemasonry. And the technology that we see today, although it's great for our entertainment sometimes, it's very much it's like a two-way mirror. So I can get access to pretty much any knowledge on the net, but the FBI is also watching everything that I do on it and knows everything I think. So that's right there. That's really that's the magician, right? It's almost like a magic show. It's like a stage magician as well. It's like you're watching something, but it's also fooling you at the same time. And yes, and and again, this technology is introduced for one thing but becomes another. So it's introduced to be entertainment, but then it becomes a way of spying on you, or it's introduced as a convenience, a time-saving technology, but then it becomes essential for your work, and you're ending up spending more hours than before, whether it's being stuck in traffic for 2 hours. The automobile was for your convenience, but now you're stuck in traffic for 2 hours there and 2 hours back. Or the cell phone is convenient, but now your boss calls you at midnight or wherever you are, and you can never escape the office. So I think the technology that's being introduced it's much more about the magician. It seems to be very good, but it really impedes on our privacy and our own time, and makes us always accessible to other people, whether we know who they are or not. So yeah.
Well, cool. Brothers, thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording now.